Welcome to the Homegrown podcast, a place where we share the truth about food and farming from our kitchen to yours. I'm your host, Liz Hazelmeyer, along with my husband, Joey.
Good morning.
And together we hope to educate, inspire, and equip you in your pursuit of true nourishment. Today's guest is Kaitlynn Fenley. She is the creator of the online fermentation education brand, Cultured Guru. Kaitlynn is a food microbiologist, educator, and blogger who focuses on teaching people how to make the healthiest and most delicious fermented food and drink. She has been teaching since 2014, and she's also been a guest on the show before. So, Kaitlynn, welcome back.
Thank you.
We are so excited. I love the topic of fermentation, especially right now as we are in the midst of our real food reset. And our theme for the third week is going to be incorporate more fresh and or fermented foods and, maybe make a little on your own. So I'm super excited for the timing of this show.
You're probably listening to this on the third week of the Real Food Reset.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
we plan things around here, guys. We plan things around here. So, Kaitlynn, I know you've been on the show before, but just briefly for those who maybe didn't hear the first episode since it was, like a year and a half ago, let people know kind of your background in fermentation and why fermentation is such a point of interest for you.
So I began fermenting in 2013, 2014 when I was in college pursuing my degree in microbiology. So I went to school at Louisiana State University in the College of Science. While there, this whole story is on the first episode we did together. But while there, I decided I didn't want to do medical school. That wasn't the path for me. And I really fell in love with real food and how fermentation can help you heal everything from your gut to your skin to your mind. And my teachers really facilitated a love of fermentation. And that was my first look at, the microbes, and I focus on the microbes that make these foods. A lot of times we say, I'm fermenting something or I'm making sourdough. And I believe you're just helping the microbes make the sauerkraut and the sourdough. So it all began with a love of microbiology, and that translated into food microbiology and focusing in on fermentation. For a while, I ran a fermented foods business with my husband, and we sold our fermented vegetables at Whole Foods Market. The pandemic really changed things for us, and kind of my philosophy on fermenting foods is that you should make them at home. I think, buying them at the store, there's a place to buy fermented foods from the store. But when you make these foods at home, you really connect to real food, and you connect to microbes in a way that you wouldn't if you just, buy your yogurt or sauerkraut from the shelf. So now I focus in on teaching people how to ferment at home with food safety and ease in mind. So we like to say where science meets simplicity. So we focus in on science and, teaching people the ins and outs of the microbiology, but at the same time, we like to make all of our recipes easy and simple.
Yeah. Well, I can attest to that because you're the only recipe I use for sauerkraut. And I never have the caraway seeds, but it's fine. Maybe someday I'll buckle up and order them. But I use your traditional sauerkraut recipe. And I love it. It's so simple. I love that you measure in grams. So it's not a guessing game and you tell me exactly how much water so I can get the salinity right. You just have a really beautifully simple, straightforward approach. And I love that. I want to talk about some of this philosophy around making the ferments yourself. I know for you guys and for us, people who don't have a homestead or have land that we're productive on, doing things inside of our kitchen can be that bridge to feeling closer to our nourishment. And I want you to explain a little bit more, go a little bit deeper into that point you just made about how you should be fermenting in your home and it's simple and you can do it. And what's some of the beauty that comes from that process?
So I think something that most people love when they start fermenting at home is first things first is you save a lot of money. When you buy raw ingredients, it's way more affordable to make large quantities of fermented foods at home. So for instance, a quart of yogurt, if you make that in your home kitchen, usually what it might cost you $2, but buying that quart of yogurt already made from the grocery store can cost a lot of money. You know, at Whole Foods, I think I saw it was like $13 for one quart of yogurt.
Oh my.
And that's, you know, that's just a little ridiculous. And I know y'all talk about, you know, either you have time or you have money to, you know, invest in your food. And for a lot of people, what they have is time. And, you know, a lot of people are feeding families, not just themselves. And so to be able to make larger quantities of these nourishing foods at a more affordable price is like a great point to making it at home. And the other thing I love is connecting to doing things by hand. I think we live in such like a digital age. You know, everything is scrolling, or you're on the computer, or you're looking at screens. And I like to call it my favorite analog activity. You know, there's these things that you can do by hand in your house that allows you to connect to, I don't know, just like an older way of doing things and a more peaceful way of doing things. And I think, you know, those are the two things people really connect to. I just read the book Old Fashioned on Purpose.
Yes, by Jill Binger. It's so good. I just finished it too. It's so good. We're going to have her back on to talk about it. It's phenomenal.
It was really great. And I really connected to the message in that like, you know, I think we get very sad going through the motions of life and stuff like that. So if you can find a way to connect to your nourishment and your food, and you feel like you're doing something great for yourself and your family, you know, gut health is a psychological thing too. So you're not only eating these nourishing foods that have probiotics, prebiotics, and fiber in them, you're also like doing a relaxing activity that can help you in a lot of ways you didn't expect.
Yeah, I love that. For those who are listening, who their first thought is like, well, doesn't fermentation take up so much time? How do you combat that? Because for me, it's kind of like a set it and forget it in most instances. But talk through the realities of the time it takes to actually ferment, time you're putting in, I should say, because you're right, the microbes are doing the work.
I think that's one of the main things that prevents people from getting started too, is they think it's this gigantic time commitment. And, you know, you see all these beautiful videos that, you know, people like you and I post on Instagram of this elaborate process of, you know, making sourdough or making yogurt or sauerkraut. And it looks a little intimidating. But honestly, like when you're making sauerkraut, for instance, it takes me, you know, 10 to 15 minutes to chop cabbage and throw it in a jar. And the rest of the time is waiting. You might need to like peek in on it, you know, like once or twice a day to make sure when it's bubbly, you know, that everything's staying clean, it's submerged. But for the most part, fermentation is a bunch of waiting around. And I think people, you know, when you say like, oh, this takes 4 weeks to ferment, they think like it's a 4-week time commitment where they're going to be having to do this and monitor it for 4 weeks every single day. And that's just not the case. So I like to always throw in, you know, it's 4 weeks, but it's probably only like 20 minutes hands-on time total.
Yeah.
And I think that makes it way more approachable.
Totally.
You make some great points. And I would even add, especially, so the time thing, first and foremost, absolutely, right? You're setting it and forgetting it. Also, when you are prepping ingredients for dinner, how long does that take? So sauerkraut's, once it's done, you're ready to eat it. Our kids eat it like for a snack.
Every single day. Yeah.
They love it. And that's a huge thing. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the saltiness of it, the savoriness of it, the tartness of it. Our kids love it. I hope everybody's kids like it. Ours do. And we see that as a huge win because like we can't get them to eat eggs. You know what I mean? So the prep time it would take to use cabbage in a dinner is around, in my opinion, the amount of time it takes to prep that cabbage to put it in a jar to put it in your pantry.
You're right.
And then what you do is you do it in bulk. So you're actually, I would argue, if you do it in a regular way and in a big enough format, you're going to be saving time overall. And then the money of that saved, you're now you have all this cabbage or cucumbers or whatever it is that you're fermenting that is not going to go bad. I mean, it's going to be preserved. This is one of the reasons why fermentation became a thing, right? Is so you could take a big bulk of ingredients and preserve it for a long period of time and eat it throughout it's like harvest would happen. And what are we going to do with all this cabbage? We have like 50 cabbages. So I don't know. I'm a big fan of it in the sense that you can save money, and there is a weird illusion of I'm going to be wasting a bunch of time on something that I'm going to eat in a day. You know, it's strange.
Yeah, I agree. I would love to get into some of the beneficial reasons for fermentation. I know, and we can talk about this in categories because I feel like fermenting veg is different than fermenting grains, which is different than fermenting dairy. So feel free to take that however you want. But I would love to talk into like why should we be eating fermented foods in the first place?
I love this question. And yes, there are different categories. And that's kind of how we set up our online course. We go over vegetables. So I start with, your cabbages, so sauerkraut and kimchi, and then we go into how to ferment other types of vegetables, then yogurt, then miso and tempeh, legumes, and then sourdough, so grains. And each of those lessons that I teach has a timeline and the microbes topic, because the timeline of that fermentation and the microbes involved in the process are different for every food. Now, fermentation is similar for all of those in the fact that it makes your food more digestible. It provides more bioavailable vitamins and minerals. It's delicious no matter what you're fermenting. And it preserves your food and it makes these foods last much longer. And so a lot of people always ask me, when you're getting into fermentation, do you need to prioritize eating like all of these foods? Do you need to make sure you're having, your sauerkrauts and your kimchis, your miso and your tempeh, your sourdough, yogurt? Should I be eating all of these for the best gut health? And the answer is yes and no, but you don't have to do it all at once. I think a lot of people fall into like an all or nothing way of thinking about fermentation, like, oh, I have to ferment everything or I'm not going to get the benefits. And that's just not true. So you can cook some cabbage and just like eat cabbage in a soup. And then you can start making sourdough and you can have some sourdough with your soup. You can ferment your cabbage the next week. You can eat regular beans and make tempeh. There's so many ways to like eat these nourishing foods that are made from raw ingredients. Not everything has to be fermented, and just incorporating one here and there and mixing it up as you go is probably the best way to get, the most benefits from fermented foods, because they are different.
Yeah, for me and my limited understanding, when I ferment a vegetable, I feel like most of the time I'm increasing the nutrient quality. Like with cabbage, I know I'm increasing the amount of vitamin C available for some reason. I don't know, maybe you can explain that to me. And then for grains, I feel like I'm increasing digestibility mostly, and perhaps also unlocking my absorption of those minerals. So I guess I am increasing the nutrient density. And I honestly haven't gotten into fermenting my own dairy because my local farm does it for me and I've just been buying it. But I know that case too is probably a combo of digestibility and increased nutrient quality. And I just think those two things we need to remember were staples in the diet. I've been really into, ever since I read, I believe it was The Untold Story of Milk, the idea of an enzyme-rich diet. It's like the average American diet is so lacking in enzyme-rich foods, and that's where I feel like I can get a lot of that from my fermentation. So yeah, any thoughts there, Joe?
Yeah, I would like to kind of dig deeper on that because I'm not 100% clear myself on, is there an increase in nutrients in vegetables that are fermented versus their raw state?
Yeah, maybe I'm wrong, but Kaitlynn, you can set the record straight.
There is. So there is an increase in nutrients in the fact that the nutrients that are in the raw ingredients become more bioavailable. So these nutrient compounds, whether you're talking about vitamins or minerals, basically think of it as they're getting unlocked and transforming into a state that can be used by your body. And that happens, in our guts too, because, we have a microbiome. There's trillions and trillions of bacteria and other microbes that live in the human gut. So when you eat these foods, a lot of that transformation happens in your gut but food doesn't stay there for long. So if you can allow that transformation to happen on your countertop before you ingest it, you're just getting a lot more of those nutrients. And that can be anything from vitamin C to compounds like GABA. I don't know if you've heard of that. I'm not going to try and say the whole word, but if you look up GABA online, you can read a lot about that. It's a neurotransmitter that helps keep you calm. So like in stressful situations, if you think of your brain as like a high-speed train, GABA is a compound that can like slow you down.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and help in stressful situations. And that is a compound that is really, really bioavailable in fermented vegetables such as pickles and sauerkraut. So just things like that. I mean, basically, if it's there in the raw ingredient, it's going to be there way more in the fermented food version.
Amplified in some degree.
And so, and I love that. So I'm understanding it now as if we were to keep that vegetable in our stomach for double the time, we would potentially yield more nutrients out of that vegetable or ingredient than we would have. But if we ferment it, it's almost like it's not degrading the nutrients, it's just making it more potent when we ingest it. Now, this GABA thing I'm interested in, and I don't want to get into it too deep here, but so slowing us down in stressful situations, just kind of throwing this out there, like if someone was experiencing anxiety or they were in a situation where they were feeling really worked up, or hey, I feel like I can't, my mind is racing, I can't get to sleep, etc. This would be something beneficial. And you were saying GABA is derived out of, was it fermented foods, or what was that again? Where do we find GABA?
GABA is in green vegetables, so such as cabbage or cucumbers. And okay, I'll try to say it. I think it's gamma aminobutyric acid is the whole
that was
phrase.
beautiful.
Thank you. But the abbreviation is GABA, and yeah, it's a neurotransmitter and it's found in vegetables. So if you eat those like green vegetables, like if you eat some cucumber in your salad, like you're likely to get some of that through the digestive process. And that compound can travel from your gut through the vagus nerve to your brain and help with, stress levels and things like that. So yes, there's actually a whole like faction of people who eat fermented pickles if they can't sleep at night. Like if they're anxious for some reason, they'll snack on a pickle and it helps them to sleep because those compounds are way more bioavailable in the fermented cucumber versus like a raw cucumber.
Wow, that's really powerful. What a good tool too. Like I almost want to serve my kids a spoonful of sauerkraut when they're like freaking out, give them a little dose of calm. That's a parenting hack right there for anyone who's listening. I'm going to try it.
Force feed some sauerkraut in those dire moments.
Yeah, you need some GABA. Well, you said it was in green vegetables. I don't know if it's in cabbage, but
no, it is in cabbage. It's in sauerkraut.
Cool. Okay, cool. Then my plan's staying the same. I love it.
That's awesome. So if we were, I'm not going to try to say it, but GABA deficient, would we potentially be seeing those side effects, or is GABA something that's like you can add it to? Is you tracking with me? Yeah. Is there something like that where you can be? Let's say I never eat salads.
Like, does our body produce it? Basically,
exactly. Like, is that something that we're going to help have us calm down naturally, or is introducing it something that is only happening if we eat these veggies?
So it is produced by the human body, but it like depends on what you're putting in your body. So, if you're eating a lot of processed foods that are like devoid of the precursor compounds that are required for microbes to turn that into GABA, then, you're not going to get that as a benefit. And so, if you can have a diet and a lifestyle that is devoid of that compound. And I mean, I would assume that you could probably see that through mental health and things like that. Like people who have maybe a lot of anxiety and stress could be correlated to that compound.
I would love to hear you articulate, because I love the way you explain things, but can you explain how the fermentation process within sourdough is beneficial to those of us who eat gluten-containing products, aka wheat?
Yes, and I love this topic. So there are sugars in foods, most foods, called FODMAPs, and that stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and I forget what the P means. It's another kind of fermentable sugar. And the first word is fermentable. Those are the sugars that microorganisms use through fermentation to create things like acids, that change the flavor of your foods and can preserve your foods. So in wheat, for instance, the main sugar is fructan. And a lot of people who are gluten intolerant, it's believed that maybe it's not the gluten that is the problem, but it's these highly complex fermentable sugars like fructan in the wheat that can cause problems for people, because if that's not fermented before you eat it, then it can ferment in your colon. And that, produces gas, draws water into the colon, and can cause digestive upset. So if you ferment, your wheat on the counter for hours or in the fridge for hours before you eat it, the microbes can digest that sugar outside of your body instead of digesting it in your colon and producing gas as a byproduct. So that's the main thing about sourdough. We've changed the way bread is made, and like conventional bread sold in the store isn't fermented with bacteria involved. So that conversion of sugars into acid doesn't happen. And so people are like, it's the gluten. But a lot of times it's the lack of a complex microbial ecosystem in the fermentation process. It's just yeast. So that's the main difference.
Yeah, I was just at dinner with friends, and one of my friends was like, well, why can't I just use a packet of yeast to make bread? Like, what's the deal with sourdough? And I was like, do we really have to do this over dinner? Like, I'm trying to relax here, And so it was funny. But to me, that's my simplistic answer is like, you need both bacteria and yeast, right? We need a complex microbiome or like a complex group of microbes to be able to do what nature wants to do, which is to leaven bread naturally, right?
Yeah, and we can expand on that a little bit. So when you have that mixed ecosystem of yeast and bacteria, the yeast are going to be doing one thing, and that is eating up a little bit of the sugar to create alcohol and carbon dioxide, and that's where you get your big bubbles and rise from. And at the same time, you have bacteria that are converting sugars into acid outright, but they're also taking some of that alcohol produced by the yeast and turning that into different kinds of acid as well, like acetic acid. And so you have all this flavor development that occurs, but they're working in tandem with each other. And then you even have yeast that can metabolize acid into other compounds. It's just a lot is going on there when you have a mixed ecosystem, and not a lot is going on there when you have one species of yeast dumped into some flour and water.
Totally. And unfortunately, most of the sourdough, at least that I have seen at the store, there's no regulation on the term sourdough, right? So it's usually a yeasted bread that's just flavored with some vinegar or some citric acid or something, and it's not a truly fermented product. And for me, my kind of tell is if they list yeast in the ingredients, then I know it's not. It has to say water, flour, sourdough starter culture, which in parentheses will say water and flour, and salt. And anything beyond that, now if they want to throw in vinegar for an enhanced flavoring because they think that's what the public wants, sure, go for that. But you have to, and I want to talk about how this translates to fermented vegetables, because I think the grocery store has duped us into our idea of what these things are. I before would have been like, I don't like the taste of sourdough. I don't want really sour bread, but the bread I make at my house is not sour. I keep a very mild starter, and my bread then is very mild. So talk to us about the difference in quality of the ferments that we might find at the grocery store if we're not shopping at, like a Whole Foods or a health food store, just some of your conventional fermented items like sauerkraut that you find in the store.
So they can be made in so many different ways. And there's even, sauerkrauts and vegetables that are in the refrigerated section of grocery stores that have been fermented, but then been taken through another process. So I know like some people add things like a different kind of salt, like calcium chloride, to their pickles to help keep the color the same and the look of the food in the jar pretty consistent. Um, and then there's people who make sauerkraut, but then it's pasteurized and put into a little bag with citric acid and things like that. And so sometimes these foods are fermented, but then further preserved. And then sometimes you can find pretty good fermented vegetables at the store. The thing that I really dislike with the fermented vegetable industry is like the amount of plastic. It's very hard to find a good sauerkraut or pickle in a glass jar. And that's because, think of all the enzymes and the acids that the microbes involved in fermentation produce that can break down plastic over time. Fermented foods last for a really long time. So, it's not an expiration date or something taking these foods off the shelf out of circulation. So they're like sitting in, the plastic bags with the little vent or the little plastic square containers for like a really long time. And so that's a huge difference for me. Fermenting at home, you really control the environment all the way from making it to how you store it. Yeah. And so that's what I would watch out for, if you do need to buy fermented vegetables at the store. Like you're saying, when you do sourdough, you want to look and make sure they're actually using a sourdough starter to make the bread. I would say make sure your fermented vegetables come in a glass jar if you can.
So I grew up understanding sauerkraut, very German family. And the way that I understood sauerkraut was a dish that we would make. And this is leading me to a question that I'm curious about. And it was, we would buy sauerkraut in the plastic bags. So totally get that. And they were probably like $2 a bag. And it was, I'm sure, not the greatest sauerkraut. Anyhow, and we would take ham hocks or just pork chops, depending on what we had available to us. And then we would take kibasi sausage and we would throw it all into a pot with like bay leaves and peppercorns and we would simmer it forever, right? And so it was like the sauerkraut, like made this broth. It was cooking down with the meat that we had, thrown in the pan as well. And it was so savory and salty and amazing. And we'd put it over top of mashed potatoes. And that was sauerkraut. So me growing up, that was how I understood sauerkraut. And so when we started like fermenting cabbage into sauerkraut here, I was like, man, the question that came to mind is like, can we make that dish that it's like nostalgia for me?
Yeah, can you cook it?
And is there a problem with cooking the fermented foods that we've prepared? Just I don't know, curious about that. What is cooking fermented items? What's the impact?
Well, first of all, that sounds delicious.
It's so good.
And there's actually some studies out there. I wish I could like reference them real quick, but about how cooking pork with sauerkraut can make pork easier to digest.
Oh, wow.
Which is really cool. But yes, you can cook sauerkraut. When you make a gallon of sauerkraut, so I make a gallon every month. So like you mentioned earlier, making in bulk really helps you save time. So I always have a gallon of it in my refrigerator. And, when I look at this gallon of sauerkraut, I'm like, how can I use this? I want to use it in as many ways as possible. And so I cook it and I eat some of it raw. We're more of like a yes and household when it comes to fermentation. And I always like to use sourdough as an example. When we're making sourdough bread, you don't eat raw bread. I hope not. You don't eat raw dough. You could taste it if you want. But you cook your bread and you're still like, hey, I fermented this. This is a long fermented product that has all these nutrients. It's more digestible. It's delicious. It tastes better than conventional bread. The same thing applies to fermented vegetables and yogurt and things like miso. You can cook it and eat it raw. I really don't like black and white thinking when it comes to fermentation. You do get more benefits when you eat it raw because you get those probiotic bacteria, but it's not like you get nothing if you cook it. If you cook it, you still get those bioavailable nutrients. You still get easier to digest food. And it can be really beneficial for people who deal with something like IBS, for instance. They have trouble, a lot of people with IBS have trouble digesting those sugars we talked about, FODMAPs. And so if you can ferment ingredients like, let's see, garlic, onion, and peppers, that's really prevalent in Cajun cooking. If you can ferment those ingredients and then cook with them, it's way easier to digest and won't upset like say someone has IBS and you're cooking for them, it won't upset their stomach the way those raw ingredients that have just been cooked would.
That's really good to know. Talk to me about how you would ferment some of these other things, because I kind of get stuck at like cabbage and carrots. So I didn't even ever think about fermenting garlic.
Sounds awesome.
But now I want to. Yeah, So talk to us about, like, broaden our horizon when it comes to fermented vegetables. What are some of your favorite things to ferment that maybe we wouldn't think of off the top of our head?
So when in doubt, you can incorporate pretty much anything into a sauerkraut. So, if you've really gotten comfortable with sauerkraut and that's kind of like your rhythm in the kitchen, you can incorporate some of those ingredients easily into a sauerkraut and use that in cooking. But when you get into fermenting other vegetables, I like to get people into a mindset of thinking like, where does that vegetable grow in proximity to the soil? So when you think about a cabbage, it's growing above the soil, but very close, as do most green leafy vegetables. So you can ferment all of those pretty much. So like celery, cabbage, what's another one, like Swiss chard. You can ferment all of those with a very similar process. And then you have your root vegetables. So things like garlic, onion, beets, those grow in the rhizosphere of the soil, so below the soil, and have a completely different vegetable microbiome. So I like to ferment those in a little different way because oftentimes those have more sugars in them. So if you try to ferment those the exact same way you would ferment sauerkraut, it might not go according to plan. And so I like to do something called heirloom culturing, and that's where I save all the brine from my sauerkraut and I'll mix that with some vinegar and use that to kind of refrigerator pickle something like beets, for instance.
That's interesting.
That is really interesting.
And then you have, I like to call them the fruits that are vegetables. So anything that grows from a blossom, like cucumbers. And those you can ferment like you would ferment cabbage, but you usually need more brine and more salt to ferment those.
Okay, that's good to know. I recently did a batch of sauerkraut and I think I measured my salt wrong because it tastes really, really salty. And I'm wondering, one, what does that do to the fermentation process if it's too salty? And two, can I save it? Can I cook it or something?
Water it down.
Can we water it down? Like, what would you do if you had a ferment that went sideways? Like, it didn't grow mold. I've eaten some of it. I didn't get sick. Like, what are the implications of mismeasuring your salt, which is exactly probably what I did?
I always like to say that too salty is better than not salty enough.
Okay.
Yeah, less will go wrong if it's just like a little too salty. And there is a way to fix the flavor. And I tell this to people too who are on a low sodium diet but want to make my recipes. They're always like, is there a way to decrease the salt? And I'm like, if you want the process to go exactly how my process went, you need to use the exact same amount. So what you can do is after fermentation, if everything's fine, it looks great, it tastes fine, but it's just too salty for you, is you can pour off half the brine and then top it with apple cider vinegar.
Oh, brilliant. I'm going to do that. I have like a whole quart in my fridge just waiting to be remedied. And I was waiting for this show so I could ask you selfishly. I'm like, Kaitlynn will have the answer. If it's not salty enough, I assume maybe something could go sideways in the fermentation process, and you might know that. How? Like, would it smell weird? Would it look like? What signs would we look for on like a fermentation that's gone sideways?
Yeah, not salty enough would most likely result in like a soft, soggy, like very soggy, disintegrating texture,
Oh, okay.
as well as possibly like mold or yeast or something growing on like the surface of the brine.
Okay.
Yeah, so you just want to look for like visual cues and like
Mhm.
sensory qualities. And then you would also be able to taste it. So, the proper salt level is very similar to seawater. It's like I think sauerkraut's like seawater is like 3.5%. So if you've ever been swimming in the ocean and some's gotten in your mouth, that is kind of the level fermented vegetables are going to be at. If it's saltier than that, it's probably too salty, and you can go a little bit less than that. But the proper amount of salt is kind of on a spectrum. It's 2.5% is where I tell people to aim for sauerkraut. But if it's a little bit less than that, it's not like guaranteed something's going to be detrimental. You kind of have a range you can work with for most vegetables.
Cool. Yeah, that's reassuring. And reassuring to know you can probably remedy, because I did like 4 quarts at a time and I was like ready for it. And then I was like, oh, I opened the first jar. It was salty. I think I threw an entire jar away. Now I regret that. And I have one in the fridge. So anyways, sweet. You have any questions? You're sitting there quiet.
No, I'm excited to go upstairs and put some apple cider vinegar into our sauerkraut. That's
He's
what I'm
like, can
excited
we
about.
do that right
Yeah.
now? That's awesome. Okay, well, talk to me about dairy. This is something that we didn't really cover in the first episode we did together, and it's honestly the most intimidating thing for me personally. So talk to me about the ways that you ferment dairy, what that means, if you're heating it. We could talk about the culture used, that kind of thing. I'm total newbie here, so.
So fermenting dairy, I like to focus in on 3 foods. So, you can, of course, make yogurt. That's the easiest. And then milk kefir, which is probably equally as easy. And then cheese, which is a bit harder to do, but very fun. I recently made my first cheese at home and would recommend. So, when it comes to fermenting dairy, I know that there is a big discussion, especially with your audience, about using raw milk versus pasteurized milk. And what I've found with fermented dairy is that there's not a huge difference between making yogurt, for instance, with raw milk versus making yogurt with a milk that's been like low temperature pasteurized, because the enzymes and microbes come from the fermentation process. Now, I tell a lot of our blog readers that if you just want to drink milk, like if you want to have a glass of milk, like raw milk is more beneficial because of those enzymes and some natural microbes that are present in the process. But if you want to ferment, it's perfectly okay if you like heat your milk a little bit for the process to make, cheese or yogurt. You're not going to deprive yourself of enzymes and microbes because they're reintroduced through the fermentation process. So for instance, I like to make yogurt in an Instant Pot, but part of that process is to sterilize the milk. But that's just heating it real quick and then like turning the heat off. And then when it comes down to the proper temperature, you introduce the cultures and the fermentation can proceed. Now, something like milk kefir, completely different because you don't have to incubate that at a warm temperature. So that's something you can play around with raw milk and culturing a little bit more than I would say for yogurt because you're not incubating at 40 degrees, which is close to body temperature, for hours at a time.
That's interesting. So raw milk, the fear is, we've heard this a bunch of times, man, if you're making yogurt with raw milk, aren't you pasteurizing it? And aren't you like damaging the pure, raw, like nutrient dense, available, factors that come with raw milk? And the explanation there is, well, in that moment, yes, but then you're introducing those bacteria, those microbes back into it to make it more available again. So it's almost like, yes, and then it comes back to where we need it to be, which is interesting. That's a good way to explain that.
Yeah, I'm so curious because I recently visited the farm that my herd share, the dairy, that's part of my herd share. And I asked them, and they keep their milk raw. And because of that, it's not like regular yogurt. I would almost say it's more like kefir. Like it's very, very thin. Sometimes it's grainy. I'm just being honest. I love it. I eat it. But they've found a way, I guess, to kind of inoculate the raw milk. I don't think they heat it very far above maybe 100 degrees, which is like body temperature of a cow. And they keep it as, quote, raw. So I'm curious with their process, do you think they're mimicking more of a kefir? Because it's not that thick, creamy yogurt. And because of that, some people are like, what is this stuff? You know, it's way different than what's at my grocery store. So is there a way to do it? And is that beneficial? Or are they just two different styles of fermenting?
I think there are mainly two different styles of fermenting yogurt, and there's no one right way to make yogurt happen. Um, so, like when you're using Greek yogurt starter cultures to make yogurt, your goal is a certain kind of yogurt with a certain flavor profile.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't heat your milk before adding in those cultures, you're going to have some wild fermentation occur too, because raw milk does have some cow microbiome involved
Totally.
within it, which isn't a bad thing if you're drinking some cold milk out of the fridge. But when you heat that milk to incubate it, say at 110 degrees Fahrenheit, you might have microbes that you don't exactly want really growing and creating flavors and textures within your yogurt. So you're not going to end up with Greek yogurt. You're ending up with more of a mix of wild fermentation if you don't heat your milk before you make the yogurt.
Yeah.
So that's really the difference between wild fermenting and culturing too. Wild fermenting is where you let the microbes in the raw ingredients kind of like do whatever they want. And then in culturing, you are picking specific microbes that create sensory experiences in your food, so specific textures and flavors.
That makes so much more sense. Thank you for explaining that, because I was stuck on the yogurt thing. I think for me and for a lot of other people who spend, $6, $7 a half gallon, it's not as economical for me to make yogurt with my raw milk. It's just I have to spend a lot of money. So if I'm going to go make a homemade yogurt, I am going to go pick up like a clone of Supernatural or one of the local dairies that is low temp pasteurized, non-homogenized, and really good organic dairy. I don't have anything against those. And so that's a good reminder, like you're adding in the incubation method. I don't know, you explained it way better. But for me to be able to do that at home more economically, I wouldn't try to ferment my own raw milk. I think I would use a pasteurized version.
In that scenario, what temperature are you taking the milk to sterilize it?
So there's two options. You can do something more around 140 degrees for about 30 minutes, or you can do 181 degrees Fahrenheit for like 30 seconds. So that's like your traditional, like pasteurize your milk real quick. And then your low temp pasteurization is around that 140, 145 degrees for a longer amount of time, about 30 minutes.
What else the reason I asked is I was thinking it's been a while. Okay, but I used to be Serve Safe certified, which means that I went through culinary school and I had like the classes to say that if I serve food, I understand cross-contamination and bacteria growth, et cetera, right? And we were always told that bacteria grows between like 35 and 145 or something like this, or like it was like 44 and like 145 or something like that, 135 maybe. Meaning that if your food is within that 40 to 1, see, it's been a while, 40 to like 140 realm, then it can grow bacteria. And so if it's above that 140, like you're saying, for 30 minutes, it's like just scraping the top of what temperature it needs to kill bacteria, but it's not like super hot, right? Whereas the 180 is like, we're well beyond that temperature, and in 30 seconds, it's all gone. Is that, let me ask you, the expert here, when does bacteria what's the temperature that bacteria dies?
So the interesting thing is it's going to be different for every bacteria. So that certification you're talking about where you learn those different temperatures, that's for disease-causing microorganisms that are usually associated with food.
Got it.
Yeah. So those are things like, your Listeria, E. coli, Clostridium, the big scary ones. That's like the temperature range where those microbes can thrive. Now, there are microbes that can survive crazy temperatures, but they're not associated with food. Like they have microbes that live inside of volcanoes.
Oh, wow.
Right.
They're
And
just chilling.
right. And like at the hydrothermal vents in the ocean. So like microbes are vast and ubiquitous in our world. But the ones associated with food that can cause harm do have like this specific temperature range where they'll thrive. And so this is why I also tell people about like milk kefir. It's not as, and this is back to maybe the texture of your yogurt that you experience from where you get it. Depending on the incubation temperature, you may not need to like be as, I guess, finicky about the temperature you heat your milk to before you culture it, because milk kefir is incubated at room temperature. So whenever you're incubating yogurt, for instance, like Greek yogurt, you're more at like a warm body temperature, probably like the temperature of a furry animal. And that's because like these microbes that are associated at the with your gut, that's the temperatures they like to grow at. But that's also the temperatures pathogens can grow at. So if you're doing that warm temperature, but you haven't sterilized your milk first, you don't know what's going to grow. You're not really like in control there. But if you do heat your milk first and then add those cultures, only the cultures are going to grow. So that's kind of the big difference.
Yeah, it's like wiping out. It's like starting with a clean slate, basically, and being in control because you're adding in the thing that's fermenting it versus, and that makes sense that kefir would be incubated at a lower temp, like a room temperature, because you're not mimicking the internal stomach, right? Our digestive tract, basically. And it's not going to allow for those pathogens to flourish versus if you try to mix and match your methods, this is maybe where people get nervous about like, oh, well, what if I heat it and I cultivate the wrong bacteria and I get sick, So I think it makes sense to, one, break that out, two, learn from someone who knows what they're talking about, which is you. And yeah, I think that breakdown helps me a lot. I feel like I could tackle yogurt.
There are so many people that are working so hard to get milk that's not heated, right? Yeah, and so I think that they feel like it's a sin to take that milk and then go heat it.
Totally.
And so I think the encouragement that I would give people after kind of this discussion is one of the value adds that yogurt is to your life is, one, variety in dairy that you can consume that is going to be bioavailable to you and nutrient dense because we're adding the cultures in to make it that way. So heat it up. It's okay. But also there's a preservation factor. Yogurt lasts longer than a bottle of milk, just straight up. But you can keep it at the back of the fridge in the coldest part of the fridge, right? And yogurt is just going to last longer. So is kefir. Sorry. True. So I think remembering the why behind it is more important than this, resistance to heating up my precious raw milk. Totally. Because I can for one say that there are weeks where we order milk and it just gets crushed straight up, gone, right? We drink it all. It's in protein shakes. It's in, our girls just drink it or whatever. Why the milk is gone. And then there's other weeks where, man, we did some traveling or whatever. It's like, it's milk. This is America. We came home and there was some milk in the fridge. We didn't get to it. And there's a part of me now that's thinking like, man, wouldn't it have been great if in advance we thought to ourselves, we're not going to get through this milk. We should make some yogurt.
Yes.
Like, that is totally an acceptable way to get the most out of the things you're spending your money on.
Yeah.
And so anyways, that's my revelation here. Kaitlynn, thank you. And sorry I ramble so long, but that was the thought.
No, that's what I was thinking too. You do spend a lot of money on, raw milk, especially if you're getting it direct from the farmer, supporting local farms, which is of the utmost importance. And there are going to be these instances where, you bought raw milk. It's not going to last as long as something that's pasteurized. It doesn't have the same shelf life because it is a living food. And if you find yourself at this point where you're like, your milk hasn't turned bad yet, but you're not going to drink it all before, it does turn bad, a great opportunity is like, okay, let's heat this up just a little bit at least and turn this into a great batch of yogurt that's going to last for 2 months in the refrigerator.
Gosh, it's so good. That's so good. Now that we're on this one just a little bit, at what point as milk begins to, a week after you buy the milk, there's a little bit of a degrading factor of the flavor of that milk. 2 weeks, you're like, I don't know if I want to drink this, right? But like 1 week, is there any factors at play there wherein my yogurt is now going to take on any undesirable sourness that my milk may have attained in the aging process?
Yeah. So if your milk's already turned, like if it's at a point where you smell it and you drink a little bit and you're like, absolutely not, this isn't good, then it's done. I wouldn't say turn it into yogurt, but if it's at that point where you're like, this probably has another day in its life, you can still make yogurt. So we don't have access to raw milk in Louisiana. It's a whole legal thing.
Yeah.
And I buy Kelowna Supernatural a lot, and it doesn't last as long as these like ultra pasteurized milks.
Right.
And so we'll buy it by the gallon, and we do use, a little bit in our coffee here and there, and then drinking a glass of it usually at night. But we always get to this point where I'm like, this milk, I can tell it's going to go bad in about a day or two. And I'm like, dump it in the Instant Pot. It's getting turned to yogurt, and it turns out great every time.
That's really encouraging.
But the heating it before is like very important at that point in your milk's life, because like already these microbes that probably won't make a very good tasting yogurt have started to maybe do their thing in the milk just a little bit to where it's noticeable, but it's not disgusting yet. So heating that milk to kill off those microbes and then introducing only the ones I want is a very important part of the process.
Yeah, I picture like it's almost like freezing it in time, because raw milk does kind of naturally sour, which is beautiful. And like, I'm not afraid to drink 2-week-old milk or put it in a smoothie. But I'm with Joe. It's like if it starts to taste a little tart, and you're like, you're kind of grimacing when you're chugging down your glass of milk.
Especially if the new batch of milk comes in.
I know, it's so tempting.
Then the old milk just sits there like, oh, well, my time is done.
I know. Crack a new one. I have a question for you, and this is along the same
line. Cook your milk. Don't be scared to cook your milk, people.
Yes. So I have milk from 2 weeks ago, but it was frozen and now has been thawed. And I'm going to go make yogurt. And is that cool? I mean, it's raw milk, but I'm going to heat it. Does anything about the freezing process mess it up, or should I be good to go?
I don't think I've never frozen the milk before, but I don't think it would change. It would change the process at all. Great. It should be fine.
Sweet. I mean, I didn't intentionally freeze it. I just left it in the cooler, and it's so cold in Ohio right now, it was frozen solid. So it's kind of a mistake on my end, but I think that's super encouraging. And it brings me back to the first kind of thing we talked about, where we have this idea of really kind of homesteading without the homestead. You're able to really make your own products in your home, get closer to the people around you who are producing your food and the ingredients. And you can do so much without having, the cow to milk in your backyard. I think that's really encouraging, seeing people like you online who really embrace that. I hope that at this point in the episode, people are like, okay, Kaitlynn, I'm ready to ferment. So I want to set them up with, what tools do they need? I'll just leave it there. Like, what do they need to get started on fermenting?
Yeah, like you might not have a homestead yet, or I know a lot of people who follow you online and me online, they have this ultimate goal, myself included, of having land, growing our own food, maybe having a dairy animal to like make this yogurt and have raw milk. But in the meantime, we can practice these homesteading skills in a smaller space. Like I live in a 1-bedroom apartment right now because we're trying to save up to, buy our property, in this economy.
Right.
And practicing these skills is so important because like when you do get to that point, you flex all these muscles of practicing. How are you going to preserve all that stuff you grow? And I'm sorry, where were we going?
Well, now that they're ready to practice, what do they need to get started to ferment their various foods?
Right. So not much. I think people, another roadblock that stops them from getting started practicing these skills is thinking that it's a huge investment on equipment and like little gadgets you need and special lids for your jars. And honestly, none of that is necessary. So it's going to vary by food product, what you need to get started. And so I like to tell people, look at what your family likes to eat first. And if you're just getting started, pick 1 to 2 fermented foods to begin with. So you can start like researching and reading about all the different kinds of processes and stuff. But when you actually like are going to get started, say you just start with sauerkraut and yogurt. And if you're going to do that, all you need is some glass jars. You need a fermentation weight for sauerkraut and a kitchen scale.
That's it.
Yogurt is very easy. You need a jar and a way to incubate. So you can do something like make it in an Instant Pot or make it in a, cute little yogurt maker. But there are innovative ways that you can incubate yogurt.
Can you do it on the stove? That's my first question.
Yeah, you can. So there's different kind of starter cultures too when you make yogurt. There's mesophilic starter cultures. Those are more room temperature. And then there's like your Greek yogurt, Bulgarian yogurt, and those require a warmer temperature. But even doing something like a heating pad for like muscle aches and stuff, that makes a great yogurt incubator.
Oh, wow.
Putting jars in a sided ice chest with like some warm water, great incubator. So there's like all these fun ways that you can figure out how to incubate yogurt. So those are really like my favorite two to start with, sauerkraut and yogurt. And then as you get like well versed in that, then you can like expand and maybe like buy some other things and try other foods.
Yeah, my first thought is like my Instant Pot has had so much broth and meat cooked in it that I would have to replace every single rubber gasket so that my yogurt does not taste like broth. You know what I'm saying? Like you open it up and you can just smell the last thing that was in there.
Venison.
And I know it is the venison. It just lives in those rubber gaskets, which you can replace. But part of me is like, I don't know that I really want to go through the effort. So if I can find a different way to incubate it, or maybe I should just, I don't know.
So we have a stock of like I have my my savory rubber gaskets, and then in another little basket in the pantry I have my yogurt gaskets, and I just change them out depending on what I'm making. So my savory gaskets permanently smell like this ramen I made. It was like Chuck stew meat ramen, and it'll smell like that forever. And if you use those gaskets to incubate your yogurt tastes like ramen a little bit.
Yeah.
So we bought extra ones just to switch out for making yogurt.
It's just the big one you're switching out?
Yeah, I'm just switching out the big one.
Okay, well then I can do that. I thought I had to like change every single rubber component. I think there's like a small one at the top, but that's encouraging that I can just swap that out. Because, I don't want to go through all that effort and then have like venison tasting yogurt.
No.
That would not be beneficial. The other thing I really like about your recipes in your blog, which is that's really the first place people should go if they want to learn about this. But for you, the equipment you have people buy is so simple and affordable. And as we talked about on the first episode we did, I one time sat through a 9-hour fermentation class, and it was by the people who make the probiotic jar or something. And it's a very, very, very expensive jar, and it comes with gaskets and an airlock. And I was told that to create ferments that were going to be healthy for me, I had to have this specific jar, and that otherwise it would create such an intense histamine response. And that really dampened my motivation to make ferments, to be honest, because I was like, I don't want to mess it up. It felt like it overcomplicated it. And honestly, those jars at the time, like I couldn't afford those jars. So if you could, and I know we touched on this on the first episode, but if you could explain how beautiful fermentation can happen in just like a ball jar with a glass weight on it, and how that is able to be used versus kind of what these other specific gadget companies are telling people, like where's the difference there?
And I think this circles back to microbes ferment. We don't. And I think like with these jars and these special lids, people really like to feel like they're in control of this process. But if you understand the microbes, you realize you don't need all of this stuff. So the ball jar with the glass fermentation weight and like a rust-proof lid, like you can use a regular metal lid, but over time the salt will rust the lid. Just a regular solid lid that screws on your jar is all you need, because through the fermentation process, you go through these 3 stages of fermentation when you're fermenting sauerkraut, for instance. And the microbes that go through this process is called bacterial succession. And in that first stage of fermentation, the microbes within the brine, so everything below the liquid level, they're going to use up all the oxygen. And so anything that stays submerged in that liquid is anaerobic. So you don't need a special lid that sucks the air out of the jar or keeps it anaerobic, because the microbes have taken care of that for you, if you use the right salt concentration. All of that goes off without a hitch, because that's just the natural microbiome of the vegetables.
That makes sense. It eats up it doesn't eat up all the oxygen, but all the oxygen leaves the liquid. And at that point, it is an oxygen-free zone for fermentation to happen. And the histamine response thing, do you hear that a lot when you're talking to people about ferments? Are they nervous to dive into fermented foods?
I do hear a lot about histamine, and I wrote a blog post about it. It's on our website. So we have a little search bar on our blog, and if you just type in histamine, you'll be able to read that blog post. But essentially, they're called biogenic amines in fermented foods. But in order to have a high histamine fermented food, you have to have the amino acid histidine for microbes to turn into histamine. And that amino acid isn't really in just cabbage. So where you'd probably run into like histamine in fermented foods would be when you add animal-based ingredients into a fermented vegetable product, like in kimchi, for instance. Like they use fish paste and salted shrimp in traditional kimchi recipes. And so those can be high in histamine. But that's not necessarily a bad thing for people who are healthy. It's only a problem for people who have diagnosed histamine intolerance.
Okay. So we don't need to worry unless you're adding in an animal product. And then I guess for yogurt and dairy, do those ever elicit histamine responses, or is that completely different?
They can, but lactobacillus, they also can degrade histamine. So through the fermentation process, microbes can turn histidine into histamine, I think using an enzyme called histidine decarboxylase or something like that. But then there's other subsets of lactobacillus, for instance, that can break down histamine. So a lot of people think, if you eat dietary histamine, it's just going to like rush into your blood or something, and you're going to have like an allergic response. That's not the case for generally healthy people, because we have an enzyme called DAO, I think it is, that degrades dietary histamine. So for most people, it's not a problem at all, because it's not very high. But now when you look at something like fish paste, which is just like fermented fish, that's going to be very, very high and can cause problems for a bigger group of people.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you for clearing that up.
Learning a ton here. What are some of the other common myths surrounding the fermentation space?
So many myths. Two of my favorites. So the first one is storing your fermented foods in the same proximity. So, if you are fermenting in a small space, like we are, a lot of people think you have to like keep your fermented foods like 6 feet apart from each other, because they're going to just contaminate each other willy-nilly. But what we have to remember is that correlation isn't causation. So like people might notice when they store different ferments close to each other, they're getting contamination in their sauerkraut, for instance. But they might be feeding their sourdough starter next to their sauerkraut. And so it's not that they're stored next to each other, but maybe they're getting like a puff of flour from the flour bag, and it's like settling into their sauerkraut somehow. It's not the proximity, but it's like cross-contamination that can cause a problem, storing them close to each other. And another one is metal utensils.
Oh, yes.
I don't know if you've heard that one.
Yeah.
Give me the. I have not. So give me the story there. What's the metal utensil doing?
There are a lot of I make videos and post them on Instagram, right? And a lot of times I'm like getting some sauerkraut out of a jar with a metal fork, or using a metal spoon to stir my water kefir grains.
How dare you?
How dare I? It's probably one of the things that gets us the most comments on some of the reels we post, because people are like, stirring with a metal spoon kills, my headphones keep falling out. Stirring with a metal spoon kills the microbes, right? What are you doing? You should be using wood. And it's like, no. So that's a myth, because I guess someone once upon a time stirred some sauerkraut with a reactive metal, but most utensils are stainless steel and are not reactive metals. You're not stirring your sauerkraut or like, getting some out of the jar with an aluminum fork.
Right.
Okay.
So
Or
it's
like
not.
copper. Would copper be another one that
Yeah.
you would not want to? So there is a okay. So there's a learning there. If we had a copper receptacle of some kind that we put our fermented foods into, that would be a problem.
Yes, that would be a problem.
Now, what causes that issue?
So the different acids and mainly the salt. So in things like sauerkraut, salt rusts, and salt causes metals to react. Like, wasn't the Statue of Liberty copper once upon a time?
Yes,
and so that's a reactive metal. And so I guess people, blanket. Again, correlation doesn't mean causation. It's not like all metal is bad for your fermented foods. It's just those reactive metals. But you can still use, like stainless steel. I mean, people have been fermenting beer and kombucha in steel vats for how long?
Oh yeah.
The metal itself isn't a problem, but it's reactive metals.
Have you fermented any of your own? Like, let's talk about drinks for a minute. I know kombucha isn't obvious, but like, have you done any of your own wine or beer or anything alcoholic in nature?
Yeah. So last year, I really got into fermenting my own cider, which has been really fun. I think ciders are probably the easiest. I dabbled in a couple wines, but cider, I don't know, there's just something about the apple juice. It just comes out great every time, and we've loved every batch. And there's so many ways you can add different flavors to it. And we have a few of those recipes on our blog too. But that and cheese has been really fun to get into over the last year.
What kind of cheese is coming out of the fermentation process? It's like what kind of cheese are you extracting?
So some cheeses are fermented, and then like some are just, like an acid reaction with milk. So recently I've only made feta. But next week I'm actually going to try a cultured mozzarella, and then making ricotta from like the whey left over from the mozzarella process. Yeah.
Wow. I wish we lived closer to each other.
I love feta cheese so much.
I know. I didn't ever think about making that ourselves.
That's another thing. So if our milk is starting, is it that milk that we're using for feta cheese?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
See, we're starting.
Well, it's usually, I thought feta was usually sheep's milk.
I think it traditionally is.
So there's different kinds of feta. So if you're going to make Greek feta, it's sheep's milk.
Okay.
But there is something called American feta, and it's made from cow's milk. Yeah.
I'm not surprised by us people. It's not.
Well, at the end of the day, right? Feta is just the physical form, and whatever kind of milk you're using to get that form, right?
Sure.
That would be my understanding.
Yeah. That's awesome. I know one of the things I love about you is like, you're so knowledgeable when it comes to fermenting, but you also hold a posture of, I'm always learning. And I want to know what else you're like leaning into. Like, what else are you learning lately about the fermentation world or the culinary world in general?
I learn so much every day. And I try to never stop learning. With fermentation, I learned through teaching. So every day, one of the students in our course will ask like a great question. And lately, my favorite phrase of the last few years has been, I don't know, but I'm going to help you find out.
That's good.
I think like when I first started, this career in fermentation, it's a really male dominated industry. And I thought I had something to prove. And I thought, I always had to have the answer right off the bat to be, an expert in my field. But I think the measure of a true teacher and a true scientist is I don't know. And being able to say, I don't know, but then, you have the skill set to find the answer. So like, I'll get a good question from a student and I'm like, I'm not sure about that, but then I'll fall into like this process of reading a bunch of scientific papers and like kind of consolidating what I've learned there and putting it in plain language for one of our students. And so I mean, the list goes on and on and on, but I'm always learning. And then also through our blog, we get a lot of requests for recipes. And then we also like use this software to make like Google friendly blog posts. And I'm like, I never thought to try blueberry cider for our blog, but I guess I'm going to learn how to make that. So it kind of never ends, the learning process.
Yeah, you've put yourself in this beautiful position of teaching from your expertise and also leading communities of people who, they come across real life questions. I feel the same way. Like, I don't feel like a sourdough expert at all, but because I wrote a guide that like 30,000 people have now walked through, I have learned just from hearing their responses and answering their questions, being like, oh, let me try this out, or let me see if that's reigned true in my kitchen, or like doing some research. And I think that's so true. That's such a wonderful posture. And I feel like your entire blog is very approachable because you're such kind of a humble teacher, but you're so incredibly well informed. And I just love the way you break things down. So that's super cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate you. Anything else you guys wanted to cover? I feel like we hit a lot of high points, but fermentation's a wild world. So.
I'm just hyped to start making yogurt, low-key.
He's like ready to get in there. Any other topics you wanted to touch on before we wrap up, Kaitlynn?
No, I think that's it. I just, if you're listening to this episode, don't be scared to start fermenting. I think, there's a lot of fear around it. People either think they're going to like contaminate something and die, or they think they don't have the time to get started, or they need to buy a bunch of, equipment. Just let go of all of that. There's a place you can start that's very simple, and take the pressure off yourself. There's no one right way to get started, and you don't have to do it all at once.
The fear thing is real. Like,
yeah.
I'd love to just, even now I'm thinking this, sorry. What is the worst that could happen?
It depends on the recipe you're using.
Okay.
So, there are these like parameters of fermentation, and depending on what you're making, they're going to be different. So for vegetables, salt concentration is like your big, huge parameter, but also how much sugar is in the ingredients you're using. There's all these different things that you can control to make fermentation go right. So like the number one thing you can do is just use a recipe from a source you trust. If you come across a fermentation recipe, just say, hey, who wrote this? And does this make sense? Is it precise? Is it repeatable? Like if you're using a kitchen scale, for instance, you can repeat your results over and over again versus, a recipe that's like, hey, use a pinch of salt in a head of cabbage. That's probably not where you want to begin. So I think a lot of the fear can be removed by just like using a tested recipe that has good reviews from a source that you trust, no matter what you're trying to ferment.
Maybe one you'd find at cultured.guru. Just saying.
There's also like an anxiety if I've left this veggie like in my pantry for weeks and I'm pulling it out and like the first bite, you're kind of like, did it work? And I think what I would say, and Kaitlynn, I'd like you to kind of, cut through my bullcrap after I say this, but there's likely very obvious signs that you shouldn't eat that if something really went wrong. Is that true?
Yes. If something went wrong, there's going to be obvious signs. So, mold growing on the surface, that's like the first thing you would see if something went wrong. A texture thing, maybe it's like super soft and smells a little weird. Maybe it smells really, really bad. I think fermentation is a great practice in trusting your senses and trusting like that, you have this intuition, because like we're animals, we kind of have an intuition of, should I eat that? If it tastes good, if it smells good, if the texture is good and it looks good, then it's good.
I mean, people have been fermenting foods for a long time with a lot less capability than we have now.
Totally.
Right. And I would tell people, I'm like, if you're listening to this, you're a smart person that is aware of like themselves, and you have so much access to information that being able to ferment food should be just a layup. And I know that I'm speaking out of experience, because even myself, when we did it the first time, I'll never forget cracking that first jar open and like taking a bite and being like, I don't know what I'm doing here. You know what I mean? And it's ever since then, it becomes very normal, very easy. And yeah, kind of what you don't know kind of scares you sometimes. So
Totally.
anyways, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. I'm glad you guys covered that. Well, awesome. Kaitlynn, can you please tell people where they can find you? Because they're definitely going to want to dig in.
So all of our free resources can be found at cultured.guru. So there's no .com, just type cultured.guru into your web browser. If you're looking for a specific recipe, you can also Google Cultured Guru sauerkraut, for instance, or like Cultured Guru sourdough discard muffins. I don't know. Whatever you're looking for, you can just type the food and then our name into Google. You can also follow us on Instagram. It's at culture.guru. And then we have our online courses at fermentation.school.
Awesome. I love that. Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. I feel like I'm more encouraged than ever to continue on my fermentation journey. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I hope your frozen milk yogurt comes out really good.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait. I'll let you know how it is.
That sounds really good. Frozen milk yogurt. Yeah.
I can't wait.
Thank you so much, Kaitlynn.
We'll see ya.
Yeah.